The following program does not necessarily represent the views and opinions of Reality Radio 101, its advertisers and sponsors, or its listening audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with psychologist, author, and speaker, Dr. Anna Baranowski, where mind, mood, and what matters to you are discussed. We're broadcasting live from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, on Reality Radio 101. Our email address is instudio101@gmail.com. And now, your host of the Bear Psychology Radio Show, Dr. Anna Baranowski.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad to be back again with you today to talk about bearing witness to evolving mind, mood, health. You know, we have conversations every month about trauma recovery, relationships, work and life adventures, and the things that are really important to you in terms of your own growth. You know, it is something that I really, really believe in. What we do in our relationships, how relationships are formed in our lives, form who we become. And today we have Lindsay Gibson, who is here to talk to us about emotionally immature people. She's spoken with us before, and she has written 6 books on the topic. So she really has a sense of what emotionally immature parents or people can do in terms of who we become, how we are shaped, and the damage potentially that this can have on our lives. So we're really fortunate to open up this conversation, and I want to thank you again, Dr. Gibson, for joining us today. We're talking today about disentangling from emotionally immature people, and the book that she's written is fresh off the press. It's a great book with great tips, exercises, and reflections. Is definitely worth picking up in terms of giving you some perspective on what might have happened to you, or if you're a practitioner yourself, what's going on with your clients? Why are they suffering so much in their relationships? This book, subtitled, is Avoid Emotional Traps, Stand Up for Yourself, and Transform Your Relationships as a adult child of emotionally immature parents. Thank you for joining us today. Dr. Gibson, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're bringing to us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me back, Anna. It's always a pleasure. Yeah, it's hard to believe I'm 6 books into this topic. I just finished writing one for therapists who like to work with this population, the adult children of emotionally immature parents. So that's just getting ready to go into production. My interest in it goes way back. It's a phenomenon that I had observed in my psychotherapy sessions with people really for years and years. And I actually had been working with it long before it sort of coalesced in my mind into this concept of the fact that my clients were dealing with emotionally immature people. Before I had that insight, we were just dealing piecemeal with the difficulties that came up in their relationships or problems with self-esteem or whatever. But one day it hit me that the people they were complaining about or talking about really were acting like 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 15-year-olds. And I began to plug into that knowledge of developmental psychology that I had. And I began to share that with my clients by saying things like, when your dad or your husband or your wife does this, I find myself thinking of like a 3-year-old who's having a tantrum, or what a 5-year-old does when they don't get what they want. Does it ever seem that way to you? They're like, oh yeah, that's exactly what it's like. So I found that there was a natural point of resonance between this idea of emotional immaturity, basically living life as if you're emotionally a little kid, and what my clients were experiencing. So the more I put that together and formalized it, the more helpful it seemed to become to them. And as a therapist, it also helped me point the way for myself toward what we needed to address, and very importantly, why. Because when you're working with someone in therapy who has had an emotionally immature parent, or maybe they're in a current relationship with an EIP, which to me means emotionally immature person, they have all kinds of experiences that don't make sense to them. They're often very confused by it. They know they're dealing with a grown-up person, and yet they feel reactive to them almost as if they were a tantruming child. And so the why of it became so clinically important and helpful to them. And out of that came my interest in writing these books to give people, through psychoeducation, a background, a framework to understand why these people are acting this way, and then how best to respond to it in a way that minimizes the harm to the client. So that's how I got started with it. And, for me, it's an endless process of discovery, because even reading literature, I was reading something about Franz Kafka today, and it's like, there it was, that's what he was dealing with. And so it's a continuous source of sort of insight and excitement for me too.
I wonder if you could start by just fleshing out what is exactly a emotionally immature person, or of course a parent, which could be a person as well, depending on whose relationship you are engaging in. And I also want to remind our wonderful listeners today, and we've got usually between 3,000 and 4,000 live listeners. So welcome and thank you for joining us again. To email us, we'll post those questions to Dr. Lindsay Gibson at instudio101@gmail.com. And, we love our listeners because the questions that they send in are so interesting and so compelling. So I hope that this topic will bring some interesting comments and questions. So maybe we can start with this idea of, what is this thing, this emotionally immature person? What is that?
Yeah. Well, we all have our better and worse days. Like, I think of emotional maturity and immaturity as existing on a kind of a continuum. And if you or I were feeling sick or exhausted, or, maybe just not very well resourced that day, got up on the wrong side of the bed, we can have behaviors that tend more toward the emotionally immature side of things. Conversely, the emotionally immature person can also have good days where things are going their way, where they feel empowered, where they feel relaxed. And at those times, they can sort of stretch their functioning into a more emotionally mature appearing level of interaction. So that's why we need to date people for a long time.
Give it a while.
Give it a while, to see if Gumby sort of, reverts back to his original shape after an attempt to stretch to impress. But basically, I think that people have a rough set point in their personality for where they fall usually on that continuum. You're not going to have an adequately emotionally mature person suddenly revert to emotional immaturity and stay there unless they have some kind of somatic uh, thing happen that puts them there. And then also the emotionally immature person is not going to suddenly, even if they apologize profusely that they've done this thing that hurt you, that doesn't mean that, excuse me, that they've miraculously, jumped up to the emotionally mature end of the continuum. It just means that they want things to go back to normal.
Well, I can kind of understand what you're saying, when it comes to this continuum and the fact that, there may be moments where, we tip over to the emotionally immature side. I took up a new game. I started to play pickleball, and, I had a notion in my mind that I was a wee bit better than I actually am. And I had a trouncing that, put me in my place today, where I played with I played 3 games, and I lost each game, and it was like, oh, okay, I have to come to terms with the reality of that. Or I could have lost my temper. I could have become very immature. I could become frustrated and lashed out at my players. But I kind of thought it was funny, although, I did kind of have to, eat some humble pie, no doubt. It's like these kinds of things. You can see how, if you are not comfortable within your own skin and open to learning, then you can slip into this really angry, entitled, embittered place over very little meaningless things.
Yeah, and I think about it as those Russian nesting dolls. We all have our inner 3-year-old. I mean, we will never take that little doll out and throw it away. It's always there in us. But hopefully we have developed these other selves, these maturing selves around that. So yeah, can we feel our inner 3-year-old when we're losing a game that we thought we were going to win? You bet. But the maturity comes in where you are in touch with that, because that's your emotional truth. But you have all these other layers, which are equally inside you, that deal with that in a way that helps it to be turned into still a fun game or something humorous or a story you tell later. Those are all emotionally mature coping mechanisms.
Okay, so I did okay. I could feel my inner child, coming to the surface, but I didn't lose my temper. That's good. Okay, good to get that from the expert. All right. I'm just wondering as well, when you think about kind of this IPE kind of relationship somebody might have. Let's say they grew up in a home with emotionally immature parents. Wouldn't that help them to, let's say, avoid emotionally immature people? Or does it make them more vulnerable potentially to developing relationships with emotionally immature people, or not having the resources to deal with them?
Yeah, unfortunately, I think it's the latter, because the effects of having an emotionally immature parent really shape you as a person in terms of
Oh, I think that Dr.
that
Gibson.
is
Oh,
that.
we lost you for a moment.
Oh, okay. So let's go back to the part about which would it be? Would you be more likely to avoid emotionally immature people, or would you be more vulnerable to them? And I was saying, I'm afraid it would be the latter.
Yes.
That and that's because when you grow up with emotionally immature people, for many reasons, they have some pretty negative effects on our self-esteem, even on our sense of sureness about what reality is, on our ability to trust ourselves and other people. There are enough of those things in there that are not, I should say, they don't make you feel confident, and they don't make you feel like you can trust your own judgment. That's a result of growing up with someone who inside is like a big kid that says, no, I'm right and you're wrong. Or it's your fault, I didn't do anything. And the person who grows up with that develops coping mechanisms that go along with that type of personality. They learn how to be dominated, or they learn how to placate, or how to people please. And so when it comes to their most intimate relationships, especially if they marry too young, these patterns are kind of in there as automatic coping mechanisms. And it does, I think, make them more potentially vulnerable to people who come along and treat them as their parents did. Now, that doesn't mean that if you have been aware of it all your life and you never lost sight of the fact that there's something about the way your parents are treating you that is not right, and that there's something about yourself that you still have trust in, that you still care about, that you can still want to protect, that can still be there with many people. So I don't want to make it sound like we're, like clay in the hands of the emotionally immature parent, but it's just that we do pick up these ways of pacifying and kind of knuckling under to these very dominant personalities, these very egocentric personalities.
You did a really interesting set of appendices in this most recent book, Disentangling from Emotionally Immature People. I want to just refer to Appendix C, which is the EIP, in Emotionally Immature Person Unspoken Relationship Contract. And this is what it says. First of all, for those who are listening, there's 16 items. I'm not going to read all of them, but you start with to remain in good standing with emotionally immature people, I consent to the following. And just think about this. Think about what you're agreeing to. I agree that your needs should come before anyone else's. I agree not to speak my own mind when I am around you. Please say anything you want, and I won't object. Yes, I must be ignorant if I think differently from you. Of course, you should be upset if anyone says no to you about anything. Those are just a few of the EIP relationship contract items that you've identified. And I just want to say one more thing before we go on to that. The way this book is structured, with its very short chapters that always have these incredible strategies, reflection and discovery exercises, and tips. So I just want to say, if people are interested in these books, this is a great one to use if you're trying to understand how you can know yourself better. Okay. Relationship contracts. Are people really making these relationship contracts? Are you seeing how that happens?
Yes, they are. But the sad part about it is they have no idea they ever agreed to this, because this all happens within the parts of our brain that are emotionally based, maybe sort of situationally aware, but not very verbal, not abstracted out into, sort of like principles or concepts. Instead, it's just something that we experience. We learn the pattern, we repeat the pattern. And in our original families, it was probably to our advantage to go along with these very things that you just read, because you're a little kid and your parent has all the power, and you have to work as a kid to have the best possible relationship you can with that parent who is essential for your survival. So what we do in therapy, or, in psychoeducation, such as reading books like this, is we begin to move that old patterned learning from our limbic, our emotional centers of our brain, and our right brain, which recognizes the pattern, which implicitly gets us to keep acting this out. we move it over to the left part of our brain, which can abstract it, conceptualize it, put it into words, so that when we feed that back to ourselves and we think about that it's as if we had said to them, yes, I agree that your needs should come before anyone else's. Once you put that into words, that that's the dynamic that this person is asking for, essentially, it's so ridiculous that you can't kind of go along with it in the same way anymore. Once you say these things, once we lay out what this unspoken contract seems to have included, people go, yeah, that's right. I think I really have been acting as if I had agreed with that. And it gives them a chance to move out of this old patterning, this old kind of relationship agreement that was never, wasn't never explicit, but that's the point. It was powerful because it wasn't explicit. When we make it explicit, put it into words in this kind of, funny tongue-in-cheek way, we can stand back from it and say, well, wait a minute, this isn't fair. Nobody gets off with, never having to hear no or never having to do anything they don't want, but they're just acting like that's their right.
Do you think there's a bit more of this going on in our world in general, like a little bit more acquiesce to another person's bad behavior, or people feeling like they're entitled to bad behavior, or they don't have to kind of grow into their adult self?
Yeah, I mean, I think all you have to do is read the news and you see it. And what's also happening is that, what sells tickets in terms of entertainment is a dramatic version of this, where people's behavior is very extreme. People are very aggressive. People are very self-assertive. People take action to get what they want. People vilify the bad guy. They, they paint themselves in these very primary colors, kind of, not very, very distinct or specific kinds of characteristics. They just, basically say, I'm good and you're bad. And when we watch a movie or a TV show, that can be fun. It's very cathartic. So yes, it's there, but I think that there is a combination of not only what people have experienced in their early relationships, but there's also this cultural preference for things that are very emotionally stimulating, and showing people that are very emotionally reactive and self-promoting, self-protective in a way, but to the point of, riding over other people and not having empathy for anyone. So yeah, I'm afraid that it does seem to be going that way.
Yeah, and it seems to play out really powerfully on social media, where you don't really have to have a direct relationship with another person, but rather just play this kind of character, and that can get a lot of leverage. I'm going to start reading through the many emails that we have, and thank you, listeners, for sharing your thoughts and questions with us today. This one is says, good afternoon, doctors. So good to hear Dr. Gibson again. I listened the last time that she was on your radio show. Looking forward to getting her book. Boy, do I know a lot of emotionally immature people. Be well. Just to reinforce just this concept that, yeah, this is really happening, makes perfect sense, right? We see so much of that, and people recognize it. So I think that's why your work is being so well received. This one is from Tate, who says, hello, what is the difference between just being immature and being emotionally immature?
Great question. So in terms of our development, we all have like these different strands of development. We have our emotional development, but we have our intellectual development, we have our social development, we have our development as a member of a certain culture. I mean, and we're all tracking on these more or less separately. All right. So that's one of the reasons why you can have a person who's very emotionally immature, and yet they're very socially skilled, or they have the ability to be very successful in business, because that doesn't really interfere with each other. You can even have a person who is socially intelligent. That is, they know how to talk, they know how to treat other people to get what they want. And the emotional immaturity might not show up until they were in an intimate relationship, or there was something that was very emotionally stimulating for them, like they're not getting what they want, or their business is threatened, or somebody seems to be a competitor. And then that's when we see the emotional component come in. And the immaturity would be high reactivity. It's a characteristic of emotional immaturity. High reactivity, low tolerance for stress, an inability to take responsibility to look at yourself and maybe think about what you did that contributed to a problem, to more or less keep in touch with reality as you're dealing with a difficult situation, because emotionally immature people tend to deny or distort or even dismiss any reality that they don't like. And in essence, you can think of emotional immaturity as being like a 4-year-old. Like, 4-year-olds have language, they're somewhat socialized, and they trick you into thinking that you can reason with them. So if they're doing something that you don't like, you can say, honey, we don't do that, blah, blah, blah. And you have the feeling that, because they have language, you can talk to them about this. That's a case where language development and emotional maturity development are not the same thing. And that kid is not going to respond to that in any kind of rational way, probably, if they're upset. So people can be immature, in their social development, they can be immature in their language development. But if they're immature in their ability to control and regulate their own emotions, and if they're immature in their ability to be emotionally intimate and empathic with other people in, truly intimate, kind relationships, then they are not able to really function as an adequately emotionally mature person. They just aren't.
Interesting. And I have another one. I actually have so many emails. I'm going to try to go through them so that people get a chance to have you respond to their thoughts, their questions. Good afternoon. This one comes from Allie. Good afternoon, Dr. Baranowski and Dr. Gibson. Thank you so much for a great interview. I enjoyed reading Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents and Recovering from Emotionally Immature Parents. Would you please talk a bit about the co-occurrence of emotional immaturity and personality disorders? And there's a second part to this question. Good question, eh? And is there an association between emotional immaturity and mental health disorders? And you know what? This is what I was saying to you before, Lindsay. We have really amazing listeners who have really thought about these issues and come out with really thoughtful questions. So this is a good example of a well-educated, a thoughtful question. And I just delight in the listeners that we have for this show, because it's exciting and the questions are really interesting. So I'm going to repeat this. Would you please talk a bit about the co-occurrence of emotional immaturity and personality disorders, and is there an association between emotional immaturity and mental health disorders?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the quality of these questions as well. That is an excellent question. I think this gets at why the books have been as popular as they have been. It's that I give a more or less neutral description of the behaviors and the problems without calling people diagnostic names. And I think it's a lot it's a lot more palatable to think of a loved one as emotionally immature than it is to call them a narcissistic personality disorder or borderline or psychopath or, whatever. Because it's descriptive, it doesn't have this stigma of a diagnosable mental health disorder on it. It's just descriptive of a kind of a developmental glitch or glitches that have caused the emotional immaturity. Yeah, the way I think about it is that people with bona fide personality disorders are probably emotionally immature by definition. They have learned patterns of coping that are very reactive, very low stress tolerance, repeated patterns of behavior that are self-defeating. So yes, I would say that personality disorders in general fall under types of emotional immaturity. Emotional immaturity and mental health disorders, of course, go together because if, at least in our culture, if you don't have adequate emotional maturity, there's so many important areas of life that are going to be affected negatively and are going to have, a cascade of secondary effects. Like, because emotionally immature people are frightened of and unable to really deal with true emotional intimacy, their relationships tend to be rather superficial in terms of like deep connection. The partners don't really know each other very well, and they get very reactive to each other. So we get a lot of disruption, a lot of fighting, a lot of separations, divorces, because the people involved, if they're emotionally immature, just don't have the kind of coping mechanisms that allow them to hold those emotions in, like you were talking about with your pickleball. They don't have that capacity to hold those emotions while they find more adaptive ways of dealing with it. And of course, that makes it so that they become much more vulnerable to anxiety, depression, all of these kinds of symptomatic mental health disorders that are signs of a person who is struggling to cope. So their relationships tend to be compromised. Their work also can be affected because of the low stress tolerance and the tendency to be me first, I'm always right kind of thing, and to blame other people. So yeah, unfortunately, they can co-occur very easily. It doesn't mean, though, that every emotionally immature person has a mental health disorder. No, I mean, and that's what gets so confusing, because people will say, well, yeah, but they did do this, but then they did this other thing. It's like, yeah, that's right. They are capable of that under the best possible conditions when things are going their way. True. Yeah. It's not like a very deep set mental health disorder. But when it comes to how it might affect you being in the relationship with that person, it's still a very serious thing, because it's going to have such an impact on the way that you think about yourself and on your quality of life if you're involved with one of them.
Exactly. That's so interesting. So this is going back to the idea that there could be underlying factors, there could be mental health, maybe somebody's a narcissist. The more important issue is that we can see disruption in relationship that plays out in a way that really it doesn't serve the emotionally immature person either. So, for sure, if somebody's struggling with emotional immaturity, this is something that they can start working on for themselves. Here's a good example. It came from your book, and it's in the chapter that's called "They Are So Contradictory It Baffles Me. Why are EIPs so inconsistent and extreme?" And this is the description. Jim finally had enough of his father, Dan's, bullying behavior. Jim told his father that he couldn't visit again until they talked honestly about how Dan had hurt and demeaned him over the years. Dan claimed to have no idea what Jim was talking about and denied that he had ever been anything but proud of him. However, He said he was willing to do anything Jim wanted to put things right. But when Jim requested a phone conversation, his father insisted on talking in person and on his next visit. Jim reminded him there would be no next visit until they talked. Dan blew up, as if this was totally unexpected, and told him he had been a good father and didn't want to hear a bunch of nonsense otherwise. Jim was dumbfounded and briefly questioned his own sanity. Hadn't they agreed to talk? Hadn't his father said he wanted to put things right? It wasn't just that Dan had changed his mind. It was that Dan made up his own version of the conversation and asserted a view of reality that Jim knew wasn't true. So this is this kind of like crazy making stuff where you think you know something and then things go sideways.
Yes, I'm so glad you picked that example, because that is what so many people go through in these kinds of relationships. Because as soon as the emotionally immature person gets stressed, and you can read that as not getting what they want, not being the most important person in the room, being asked to wait for gratification or do something they don't want to do. I mean, as soon as they hit that, it's like fairness and reality testing go out the window. Doesn't matter what you said before. It doesn't matter what the facts are. It doesn't matter about being fair or considering the other person's feelings. Nothing matters except winning. And in this case, Dan was going to win the prize for being the good father. And that meant that Jim had to be the ungrateful son. And that was a story that Dan was going to stick with.
And that goes back to this incredible contract that you recognized in your appendix. And it also relates to another appendix, which is another one that I think is really useful for people to have access to, which is Appendix D, the Bill of Rights for Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. And, you know, it's a good starting place if somebody thinks they're in a relationship that they need to set a better boundary, even if it's not with an emotionally immature parent. I read through it, and, you know, it's really pretty useful, you know, just if you took the time and read through this Bill of Rights, you'd start to be able to challenge yourself on, you know, are there relationships that you're having where you feel that you are being trampled, where you're not having a balanced and equal and mutual relationship. So, you know, here's an example. I have the right to set limits on your hurtful or exploitative relationship. I have the right not to be your rescuer. I have the right to do any and all of my, I have the right to any and all of my feelings. I have the right to know whether I love you or not. I have the right to say anything as long as I do so in a non-violent, non-harmful way. I have the right not to do things if it's not good for me, and, you know, on and on. I mean, there's so many of them, and I love them. They're really fantastic. So I would encourage people, you know, if you want to kind of learn a little bit more about it, this is actually a really good book with lots of great tips in it as well. Here's another email. This one's from Dare. Hello, doctors. It's actually from Daredevil. Does being emotionally immature ever lead to violence?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I mean, just think about it. If I told you that whatever you did was right, that you were entitled to be the most important person in any encounter, that other people were deliberately causing you problems for no good reason. If I said that, yeah, you know, it's normal for you to blow up under stress or get in somebody's face when you don't like what they said or your feelings were hurt. Yeah, if we had a person that believed all these things, then what's to say that violence wouldn't be the next step? I mean, because it all comes down to this kind of deranged entitlement Now, in a 4-year-old, we don't call that deranged, right? We just say, oh, he's a little kid, a little preschooler. They lose their tempers, yes. But if you don't develop the coping mechanisms and the psychological maturity to transform that into other ways of dealing with life and other attitudes, like other people are just as important as I am. People have feelings too. I know that I will hurt them if I say or do this. People's subjectivity and their right to exist feel sacred to me because I know I exist and how I would feel. This kind of give and take, all these breaks on our kind of acting out of our, most ignominious impulses like violence, all those breaks are very compromised when you haven't grown up entirely inside. And it's easy to slide back into that. And then with low stress tolerance and that feeling of entitlement, yeah, I mean, it's very easy to see how that could go into violence.
So now this brings me to something else that I think is related, and that is, when you are an adult child of emotionally immature parents, sometimes you can develop your own style in response to that shaping experience, that shaping as a child, and you can become either an internalizer or an externalizer. And I think it would be really useful for people to understand the difference between the internalizer and the externalizer when you're on the receiving end of emotionally immature parents or emotionally immature people, and how that might play out to maybe shape you to become an emotionally immature person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like people who have, there's kind of a dividing point between these two different types of dealing with life. The internalizer tends to take stuff in, try to understand it, process it, chew on it, and they try to learn and figure out what's going on. They're natural deep processors. I think they're born with it. Learning is very interesting to them. Figuring things out is interesting to them. It's just where they go when they're stressed. But the externalizer is more like, like the 2 or 3-year-old. It's like input in, output explodes. Stuff does not get processed. It kind of comes in, it hits a reaction. The reaction is acted out in some kind of behavior, usually at someone else's expense. And the biggest characteristic of the externalizer is it's not my fault, it's your fault. They go through life wondering why bad things keep happening to them. It's almost as if they're walking around saying, why are all these things falling out of the sky and hitting me on the head? Like I had nothing to do with this. I had no role in my difficulty with my child and no role in the divorce or getting fired or whatever. It's just all this bad stuff starts to happen to me because of these mean people who don't see things from my point of view. If they would shape up, I could have a perfectly good life. That's sort of like the externalizer's credo. So when you're in a relationship with someone who's an externalizer, I mean, that's easy to imagine, isn't it? I mean, the opportunity for gaslighting is enormous because the emotionally immature person, and I think most externalizers are emotionally immature, they will kind of look for opportunities to show how they are not to blame for anything and how you need to be making it up to them. So in that story about the young man and his father, the father very much was saying, you're the cause of this, and therefore you should do whatever I tell you I want to do in order to repair this, even though he had just agreed that he would talk about it before they had a visit. So we have to remember that if you're an internalizer, and you take things in, you have empathy, you're a natural processor. When an externalizer starts saying, I didn't do that, I didn't say that, you made me do that, it's your fault, what's the internalizer going to do? Naturally, they're going to take it in and say to themselves, is there a grain of truth to this? Did I maybe do what they said I did? Let me think about this. So sometimes we have to help people be a little less internalizing and a little surer of their own judgment about a situation at a kind of a gut feel level. So they learn how to trust their feeling that, no, hey, wait a minute, this is not reality. That is not what happened. I remember what they said, even though I'm confused right now. I remember what they said, and I know that this is not something that I did. That is a skill that we have to work on in therapy or through self-development to get out of the kind of passive tendency that a lot of internalizers have to give the externalizer the benefit of the doubt, try to see it from their point of view, thinking that they in turn will respond by being fair and empathic themselves, which never happens.
So that's a really important point, because I think, if you are an internalizer, being able to see the situation accurately can be incredibly difficult, because sometimes we just don't know what we don't know, and it's not because we're not good and competent or capable or emotionally adept. It's that we cannot see. This thing is like a blind spot for us. And this brings me to the next question, which is from another listener. Is therapy the only way to cure being emotionally immature, or are meds involved?
Well, I think that meds can be very helpful in lowering the anxiety and the reactivity of a person who is emotionally, developmentally is emotionally immature. Because, it's not an easy way to live, to be emotionally immature. It's like you don't have your batteries included. You don't have anything inside you to fall back on when times get rough. Blaming other people has its limits as a coping mechanism. It doesn't leave you with anything. You can't transform adversity into anything that helps you grow. You just keep yourself stuck at the same level with the same distorted interpretation of reality. So that's a very stressful way to live, because life is too complex to accommodate that kind of oversimplicity, if you want to call it that. So one of the things that medication does is it can help calm those people down enough that they can then become receptive to therapy, or maybe it's support groups, or could be different kinds of substance abuse groups if that's a problem. It could be getting coaching, and then it could be regular psychotherapy. That is really helped along when a person can be a little bit calmer and less reactive, because they're able to hear what the therapist or what the other group members are saying. Otherwise, they're so defensive, so they erect these boundaries, like so instantly, they feel under attack. You just can't get through to them. So yeah, therapy is not the only way, but I'll tell you what, I think for an externalizer, it's really important that they get with somebody who can help guide them through this process and give them hope that they can change by pointing out, what they're doing better at, what they still need to work on, give them ideas about, here's an alternative response you could have tried. What would it be like if you thought about it this way? You have to have someone who's standing in a different, more emotionally mature place to give you the ideas that you need for self-change if you're an externalizer, because you're not going to come up with those on your own. And if you can just get that idea that there's hope for me, I can learn more mature coping mechanisms if I'm willing to work on it. And I think that it's ironic, but I think that for a lot of emotionally immature people, these books have also sort of opened their eyes to some of their behaviors, which they didn't come up with originally, probably. I mean, they probably got it from their background, from their early relationships. And now it's giving them a chance to say, oh, wait a minute, I can look at myself in a different way. And maybe I'm doing this thing, called emotional immaturity. And how do I improve that? How do I stop doing that so I don't keep having these bad results? But I think for internalizers, they can probably, I think everybody who's working on this kind of deep stuff does better when they're in therapy, period. But the internalizer, I think, has a leg up because they can read things, conceptualize things, and process them in ways that they can initiate that process of internal change and self-observation that is necessary.
I want to just remind our listeners that Dr. Lindsay Gibson is a clinical psychologist and psychotherapy with more than 30 years experience. I am being asked where Dr. Gibson's books can be found. And of course, you can go to her website, Lindsay Gibson, PsyD.com, or you can go to New Harbinger Publications, which has published all of her books, or go to Goodreads to read up a little bit about each of the books from people in the community who are reading the book. The current book, Disentangling from Emotionally Immature People, is available widely online. And of course, if people want to go to your local booksellers or, order online through Amazon, you can, find it very, very easily. So definitely, take a look at the different books because there's so many of them out there now to find the book that is the best fit for you. And we only have 8 minutes left. I know this goes so quickly, and I want to capture at least one or two more emails. This one is from Lisa, and she says, I've read the previous book and listened to Lindsay before. I have a more personal response, which I had before too. I think the title, Emotional Immaturity, is almost too nice for the abusive behavior that people enact. I'm just curious as to her response.
I totally get it. The problem is that you have to be fairly advanced in your own recovery or your own psychological development to be able to handle the idea, I think, that your parents may have been, more starkly put, toxic or abusive, or even mean or cruel. I mean, these are things that a person has to have a fair amount of self-observing inner strength to be able to tolerate that, because a lot of people can't stand to think such thoughts about their parents. I mean, the fact that someone is using those kinds of words to me means that they have a lot of awareness about how the behavior affected them. And they have that processing power that allows them to name it for what it is. And then they have the emotional maturity inside themselves to be able to stand it, that I'm thinking that my parent was cruel or my parent was toxic, whatever. There's more stark characteristics. If you don't have that comfort level with, calling it out for what it really is, then I think a more neutral term like emotional immaturity helps bring people into being able to define the intensity of the behavior that they may have suffered. And they might get to the point where they decide that, yes, this was abusive, or yes, this was gaslighting, or whatever. But I don't think it's I think we would probably shut out a lot of people if we came out of the gate calling it these more stark terms. I wanted to make sure that people could find a way into the subject without feeling like they were betraying their parent, which is a huge issue for anybody with an emotionally immature parent. They always feel guilty, always feel like they're betraying the parent. They can never do enough. They're just saddled with that until they figure all this out.
Yeah, and it's a hard starting point. I can understand wanting to name things accurately, but I can also understand, if we shut down the conversation too early, then we may lose the opportunity to really kind of digest something that's already so hard to digest. Like, I think this is really, really hard to digest, so as a starting point, I actually, in some ways, I think emotionally immature person is kind of I wouldn't want somebody calling me emotionally immature. That would give me kind of a pretty odd feeling. So it's language. It's just kind of how are we going to use our language so people can come on board and actually do the growing that they need to. And that's never an easy thing to do. Good question. I have to bring this piece up because this came from your book and it's such a useful question. This is on page 62. And the question is, and now, just for a moment, just out of curiosity, I would ask our listeners to just take a moment and think, how would your parents describe you? I just love that question. I don't think I've heard other people come up with that. And I think it may really give insight to people about what rules they have been following, what contract items they may have been following, both with their parents maybe, as well as other people in their life who may actually meet this title of emotionally immature person. What do you think of that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think it was April 1st, I have a guided journal that also came out after this book that we're discussing here. So that just came out, what, a month, 2 months ago. And in that, one of the questions that I asked is, if I interviewed your parent, how would they describe you? Or what would they say about this or that about you? And I use that as a journal prompt. The name of that book is Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, a guided journal. And that's also available with the rest of them. But when I ask that question, it's to get them to think about how they were seen by their parent as a way of getting free of that, as a way of seeing that, yeah, my parent didn't probably really see me as the person that I truly am. They didn't understand what life was like for me or what I'm really like as an individual. In fact, they didn't seem to be very interested in my individuality as much as they were interested in me conforming to who they expected me to be. These are very common things. But that is a way of helping people to stand outside the dynamic of the relationship of the parent and child and ask themselves, okay, how do you feel for that child if their parents saw them this way? Do you think that was accurate, having been on the inside? Do you think that your parent distorted things about you? What was it they didn't see in you? What did they miss in terms of what you now know about yourself and the qualities that you now own? And that exercise is so revealing of kind of the narrow role or the narrow little box that parents, emotionally immature parents, often put their children in so that the parent, can feel safer or have better self-esteem, because the child is building them up, instead of vice versa, the way it's supposed to work. The parent supports the child.
That's beautiful. And it kind of gives such a nice pathway to self-development. We have literally 1 minute left, and I'm going to read from your book because there's something really lovely here. Some EIPs have a way of making you feel naive or needy if you express an emotional need for recognition. They often justify their emotional withholding with the excuse that grown-ups shouldn't need extra attention, but they are wrong. We all need it. We all need praise and appreciation. It is not infantile. It is normal reciprocity of social life. I want to thank you, Lindsay, for joining us again, and all of our wonderful listeners. Thank you so much. This is such a great honor to talk to you, Lindsay, and I hope we'll get a chance to speak with you again. Any last words?
Just that it's been a great conversation. These questions have absolutely touched on everything I would have wanted to say. So thank you so much for having me, Anna.
Thank you. It is a pleasure. Be well, everybody. Looking forward to talking to you again next month. Bye, everyone. Bye, Lindsay. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you for listening to the Bear Psychology Radio Show with your host, Dr. Anna Baranowski, right here on Reality Radio 101.